The following is a 45-minute selection of topics from the full DVD available on our website. See lots of steam and early diesel power that has vanished from the scene, as well as a way of life for the people running trains. Learn the how and why that brought the forming of the Burlington Northern Railroad back in 1970, and how it was long overdue.
During the 70s, the Burlington Northern became a familiar face in a large part of the U.S., operating nearly 29,000 miles of track before it became today's BNSF system. The BN began on March 2, 1970, spreading its Cascade green and white paint over the principal lines of the Great Northern, Northern Pacific, Spokane Portland and Seattle, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, among others. A whole generation of rail fans grew up along with the BN, and they will miss its old look and how it competed with its rivals in the West. The years rolled on during this quarter century of successful operation, helping to bring the railroad industry out of a decline and into a modernized mode of transportation. The public had gained the perception that railroads were archaic and unable to compete in the modern world. But the BN and others made the adaptation and proved them wrong by any standard. The railroad industry was America's first great industry, and it became revitalized in some large measure by the success of the BN merger. To understand the great significance of the Burlington Northern merger in 1970, we'd like to show you some of the other players in the industry that the BN and its predecessors competed and worked with. The 1960s started with a round of railroad mergers. Examples of roads funneling into the nation's rail hub in Chicago include the 1960 combining of the Erie and the Delaware-Lackawanna and Western into the Erie-Lackawanna. The Norfolk and Western was on a roll, taking in several smaller roads, and the Wabash and the Nickel Plate roads around 1964. Much of the merger activity then was from having too many duplicate roads in the overbuilt East and also the Midwest. There was a time in our history when many roads were built with no other chance of success beyond attracting investors' money. As a result, many would fall in and out of numerous bankruptcies and reorganizations during the 20th century. The Chesapeake and Ohio gradually took control over the line that dated from the beginning of it all, the Baltimore and Ohio. This merger was the beginning of the modern CSX system. The Chicago Great Western was merged into the Chicago and Northwestern in 1968, but most of that trackage would be deemed redundant or unproductive and abandoned later on. The weakening health of the once mighty Pennsy and the New York Central created the combined Penn Central system by 1968. This merger of two incompatible old rivals was doomed to fail in a 1970 bankruptcy that shook the railroad industry. The Penn Central failure cast a large shadow over not only the industry, but also any new large mergers. Congress would reorganize the mess into Conrail by 1976, which earned its way back to a respectable operation over time. The Burlington Northern was formed by a merger approved by the ICC in 1970 from 3 principal and 3 secondary railroads. As time went on, other major lines would fall into the BN camp. The merger had its beginnings in 1956 from planning by the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. Other elements of the merger were all in one way or another owned and controlled by the GN or the NP. The original BN formed a 23,000-mile system from Chicago to Canada, the upper Great Lakes, and out to the Pacific Northwest with an additional line reaching down to the Gulf through Texas. The Great Northern and the Northern Pacific were the principal lines, and between them they owned the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or CB&Q. The CB&Q was actually the largest of the 3 in track miles. The CB&Q owned the Colorado and Southern and the Fort Worth and Denver that provided the connections down to the Gulf through Texas. The BN itself is now wrapped into another merger of 1995, forming the Burlington Northern Santa Fe system. Many rail fans grew into the hobby since 1970, and the quarter century of the old BN will be missed by them. We created this video to look at the original 1970 merger and review some of the achievements of the Northern Pacific, Great Northern, and the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy. The Northern Pacific was conceived during the American Civil War to add a second transcontinental line to the Pacific. The charter, signed in 1864 by President Lincoln, was to build from the Great Lakes to Puget Sound over a course much like that followed by Lewis and Clark's expedition, dating from 1806. Construction started in 1870 and had many problems with financing, punctuated by the country's financial panic of 1873. The line was nominally completed by 1883, with all the promotion possible, even though much work remained to finish tunnels and eliminate all the temporary track work and maze of switchbacks in the mountains. The Northern Pacific's bankruptcy of 1893 intertwined with the country's financial panic of 1893, and it weakened the Northern Pacific. While in receivership, the NP had famous J.P. Morgan as a financial agent. James Hill of the Great Northern became interested in the Northern Pacific, and Hill had a way to buy into the NP at a bargain price. By the turn of the century, the country's two most dynamic railroad men, James Hill and E.H. Harriman, would enter into a fight over control of the NP. Their heavy purchases of stock drove up the value to extraordinary prices per share. Despite their repeated attempts to negotiate, the ongoing fight attracted the attention of the government. Teddy Roosevelt was sworn in as president by 1901 after McKinley's assassination, and his reformist policies would have an effect on the fortunes of the two railroad rivals. After its 1893 bankruptcy, Harriman gained control over the Union Pacific, and by 1901 he had rebuilt it into a formidable railroad. Harriman also controlled the Southern Pacific by 1901, adding to the threat of controlling the West. James Hill and his ally J.P. Morgan formed the Northern Securities Company as a holding company for the Great Northern and the Northern Pacific. The U.S. Supreme Court broke up the Northern Securities Company by 1904. James Hill would continue to operate the two railroads, but as separate companies. Within a year, the two roads created the Spokane, Portland, and Seattle Railway to stop Harriman's spreading Southern Pacific in the Oregon market. The Harriman Empire would lose the SP by Supreme Court order by 1913, but the Northern Pacific had been secured by James Hill to become one of the key elements in his Empire of the North. The NP would be on good footing from then on and improve and grow into a 6,700-mile system. A progression of steam power ultimately brought the 484 Northern class and the giant Yellowstones capable of handling tonnage in mountainous territories. Both Hill and Harriman represented a new breed in railroading. They vastly improved the standards of everything they touched. They believed in putting earnings right back into the railroad and using first-class material that was made to last. Many other roads, taking outside investment money, were forced to bleed their businesses to satisfy returns to their investors. James Hill was his own source of investment money, and he was a patient man. James Hill was also involved with the building of the Canadian Pacific Railway at one time, and he considered a Canadian route for his own empire. Born as a Canadian, Hill worked equally well on both sides of the border. This Canadian Rockies track could have been part of the empire, but for a few other opportunities that returned his focus to the U.S. side of the border. James Jerome Hill was born in 1838. He had an early vision of trading with the Orient by sea. In his early years, he had to settle for working as a clerk on a riverboat line in Minnesota, and he learned about setting freight and passenger rates well. After the Civil War, he worked in a similar capacity for the small St. Paul and Pacific Railroad. The panic of 1873 severely weakened the line, and Hill used his own savings and money from a few partners, and they bought the line for a very low price. This was the seed line of his Great Northern Railway that he built to the Pacific. He earned the reputation as the Empire Builder, and the beautiful streamliner carried the same name to the Amtrak era. Between the Great Northern and his Northern Pacific, the Northwest was built up from wilderness to productive farming and businesses providing natural resources. The access to the Pacific Ocean at Seattle and Portland gave the Hill lines the access to the Orient trade with Japan that had fascinated Hill from his youthful days. That would eventually blossom with the addition of one more key line that Hill would add to his empire. In the earliest days of railroads, their purpose was largely to serve water vessels by extending the reach of seaports, rivers, and canals. Over the decades, railroads opened up new territories in the vast middle of the country. As time goes on, the railroads are working the sidings and branch lines less and less as they concentrate on serving water vessels more and more by moving seagoing containers between east and west ports. The other core business is moving vast amounts of bulk commodities such as coal and grain, often to seaports for export. One more great line that served the Hill lines was the CB&Q. The Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or the Q, dated from a modest predecessor beginning in 1849. The line grew to connect with both the GN and the NP in the twin cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. The Q's lines extended to Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, Colorado, and other points to the northwest. E.H. Harriman wanted the Q for his own, to connect his Omaha, Nebraska-based Union Pacific line into Chicago. James Hill beat him to the punch on this one too. The Q was a perfect addition to Hill's plans. His GN and NP moved most of their loads to the east in the form of produce and lumber. Many cars returned to the west empty. The addition of the CB&Q gave vital connections into Chicago from St. Paul and added to loads heading west. The Q's access into their territory brought manufactured goods, cotton, textiles, and grain that could be shipped for export from Seattle. By 1901, the Northern Pacific and Great Northern jointly purchased the CB&Q. The Q had a good financial history, but it would nevertheless benefit from being in the Hill camp. At the same time, the Hill lines could grow with the Q's connections and online freight loadings. Turning the clock back to the building of the Panama Canal will reveal an interesting story that is deeply intertwined with railroad lore. While Hill and Harriman's activities were under the scrutiny of President Teddy Roosevelt's administration, the Panama Canal was being built. The French had failed years earlier, leaving broken and rusting machinery and unfinished work being reclaimed by the jungle. But now the determination of Roosevelt, more modern power tools, and the utility of the railroad would make it work this time. Roosevelt was keen about the value of sea power, and he remembered how warships during the Spanish-American War were always on the wrong ocean to respond to events. The canal would end the days of ships running the entire course around the tip of South America to go from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. The building of a canal would seriously cut into shipping by rail, especially for goods shipped from the east to Asia. After 9 years of heavy work, the canal's opening seemed like a dark day for the railroads, but the canal did effectively showcase American abilities and its willingness to project power with shipping and a more flexible navy. This would help grow the country to a larger economic size, and eventually the railroads would also benefit. The scramble was on, and an army of men and machines raced to build the canal while Teddy Roosevelt dealt with the politics of objections to its building at home. While weaker presidents would have minced time away, waiting for congressional approval for every detail, Teddy was the type to charge ahead, get the job underway, and apologize later. It was no surprise that men like Roosevelt, Harriman, and James Hill would have their clashes. They all had been cut from the same cloth of greatness. James Hill had already lost John Stevens to the canal building. Stevens was the original surveyor and civil engineer in the early days of much of Hill's Great Northern Line. Stevens had another engineer in his canal building project, the young Ralph Budd. Budd, a brilliant graduate civil engineer, did a remarkable job in helping to build the canal's railroad across a dense mosquito-infested jungle. The Canal Railroad was essential to the project. It was successful and ahead of schedule in its construction. The canal was one of the world's greatest projects at the time, with massive movement of jungle, then earth. James Hill was impressed with Ralph Budd and he eventually hired him. Budd became president of Hill's Great Northern quickly after that. After a time improving the Great Northern, he moved on to the CB&Q, where he really flourished. Budd entered the Q at its worst financial state. In 1932, in the throes of the Great Depression, he successfully brought the company back without government loans and the reorganization and intervention that would have come with it. With the Dust Bowl economy in effect, he had to improve the railroad with less agricultural traffic to haul and earn revenues from. Passenger travel was also down, and cost exceeded revenues, making it look like a loser. Budd was an early advocate of diesel power, and it was in the worst part of the Depression when he envisioned a new way to operate passenger trains and bring the public back. He worked directly with Ed Budd, no known relation, of Budd Manufacturing Company to design the Pioneer Zephyr. The concept was to create a light, fast, economical train that could attract passengers back to the rails. The automobile had already started the decline of rail travel by the 30s. The 1934 Zephyr was intended to fire up the public with visions of clean, fast modern trains running routinely at 100+ miles per hour with safety. The name was taken from Zephyrus, the mythological Greek god of the west wind. The train's speed came from light but strong stainless steel structures using new patented welding techniques that didn't change the strength of the material in the welding process. The cars were permanently coupled and they shared trucks to reduce friction and total weight. Every single item in this train was designed specifically for speed, strength, and light weight. The train was showcased in a May 1934 record-breaking run, taking only 14 hours between Denver and Chicago. Many sections found the train running well above 100 miles an hour, and nothing else was allowed on the track. Switches were reportedly bolted or welded to the straight-ahead position to preclude any mishap. The impact on the press and the general public was enormous, and people talked about the train and flocked to the train. The positive impact paid off on Ralph Budd's calculated gamble, and the CB&Q's luck began to turn positive from that point on. In June 1934, the train was at the opening ceremony of the new Moffett line on the Rio Grande in Colorado. Now, Rio Grande trains could go from Denver to Salt Lake City in a direct route, bypassing Pueblo and the grueling Tennessee Pass. Some years later, this would benefit the California Zephyr on the Rio Grande's section. On westward to the Western Pacific on its tour, and stops along the way gave California passengers a glimpse of their future in 16 more years. This 1934 Zephyr was America's first diesel-powered streamlined train, and it was assigned to the Kansas City to Omaha run until retired. Eventually, a fleet of Zephyrs was built with improved power and more cars and amenities. The Twin Cities Zephyr was one of the best known. This type of equipment was used into the 60s, and it was unique to the CB&Q. The half-locomotive, half-mail baggage car with its front power truck was built for speed and not much pulling power. The 660 original horsepower machine is notable in that it truly was the first diesel-powered streamliner. The Q also ran more conventional trains for heavy traffic and longer distance trains. They also forwarded the NP and GN's trains from the Twin Cities to Chicago. These locomotives were EMD's E-units with high-powered dual diesels. Many carried the same styling cues, with the red nose trim simulating the air intakes of the original Zephyr. And of course, the simple, clean, unpainted stainless steel sides that have enduring elegance. The connection between Ralph Budd and Edward G. Budd of the Budd Corporation would continue with more trains, and the last Zephyr, the California Zephyr. But some plans would need to wait for the war looming over the country. Just as the Depression was wearing off, the country was suddenly involved in World War II when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Millions of Americans would learn of the event by radio, and once again the country's railroads would have to respond to a crush of troop and freight trains to support the war. Ralph Budd would help the country and its railroads by running the railroads as Federal Transportation Commissioner during World War II. The lesson of World War I was that during wartime the government's takeover of railroads could wreck even the strong ones when operated by government edicts, especially by men who didn't understand the business and its culture. President Franklin Roosevelt was persuaded to assign the overseeing of rail operations, if war broke out, to Ralph Budd. Budd started making the preparations even before the war started, and the railroads were ready when the moment came. These scenes provided by BNSF are from the Santa Fe, who back then, along with all the rest, pitched in to move goods and troops. This story repeated itself 1,000 times over each day until the war was over in 1945. In 50 more years, the Santa Fe itself would merge with the Burlington Northern to form the present-day BNSF system. The tonnage of war goods and raw materials could have overwhelmed the railroads if they didn't have a workable central plan from someone that thoroughly understood the art and science of railroading. Sure, there was lots of grumbling along the way, with new equipment on allocation, and many railroads were forced to accept locomotives that weren't their first choice for new power. In the large picture, the assignment paid off, and this time, most railroads were in good shape by war's end. Most had gained improved track, signals, and freight car fleets, and they met every demand in the process. By the war's end, most had money in the bank and plans to improve their service to a new and expanding peacetime economy. Ralph Budd returned to the CB&Q, and he had one more great achievement to participate in. The early scenes of the Pioneer Zephyr touring in Rio Grande and Western Pacific territories in the 30s gave a forecast of things to come. These views are what would become the standard for American scenic luxury travel. As we watch these scenes, it's important to remember that the schedule was arranged for sunlight in the scenic spots. Speed was secondary. During the war, and from an idea of General Motors' Cyrus Osborne, plans were sketched up for dome car trains to create a better scenic experience for passengers in the expanses of the West. The speediest part of the trip was on the CB&Q's fast main line, searing through the more ordinary scenery in darkness. The war's end reawakened the interest in the California Zephyr. It would take 4 more years before the train would operate over the CB&Q, the Rio Grande, and the Western Pacific, but it was the last word in Zephyr lore, and it would be worth the wait. We leave the scenic San Francisco Bay Area at 10 a.m. running down the old streets of Oakland and on the WP's tracks. The WP was a latecomer to the West, opened by 1910 and built mostly with money from the Gould Empire that owned the other partner of the California Zephyr, the Rio Grande. The Western Pacific had the Feather River Canyon route that was the main draw over the 928 miles to Salt Lake City in Utah. The Zephyr continued through the Nevada desert and western Utah during the night to arrive in Salt Lake City, Utah. The passengers in the tail-end dome observation car had the premium view with a bar for Pullman passengers, and a quick climb up the staircase brought the famous dome car view of scenery. The Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad bridged the Zephyr to the CB&Q in Denver, Colorado. The Zephyr's menu included fresh brook trout, prime steak, and dishes associated with the regions the train traveled through. Dome seats were unreserved and unsold seats and provided for all passengers, coach and Pullman alike. In the summer, the Rio Grande's ride included sunlight all the way to Denver, Colorado. The California Zephyr left in darkness from Denver to run 1,034 miles to Chicago. This was the fastest part of the trip, and patrons would arrive in Chicago by 2 p.m. the next afternoon. To better show the experience of leaving Denver eastbound, we'll hop on a different train. These views of the CB&Q Denver Zephyr to Chicago at the dawn of Amtrak's era in 1971 give a few glimpses of late afternoon light. The Denver Zephyr was equipped much like the California Zephyr. The gleaming stainless steel cars and the silver E9s pulling up front were the influence of Ralph Budd of the CB&Q. The original California Zephyr's 3 railroad partners purchased the cars to support 6 10-car trains. The trains expanded to 13 cars with rising popularity. They all carried the California Zephyr name above the windows and reporting marks of each road at the car's ends. The 2,500-mile Zephyr run took 2.5 days total, and it was conceived from the start as a sightseeing experience. It could compete with air travel with this edge, and the 2.5 days could still compare favorably with auto travel. It offered more comfort than both, and passengers would arrive at either end of the system refreshed and in good spirits. This strategy worked until the 60s and the expanded interstate highway system, and with the arrival of jet air travel. The cost of operation began to exceed revenues, and the equipment was getting older. The increased maintenance strongly suggested purchasing all new equipment. All these factors were a burden that fell the hardest on the Western Pacific. The WP was the first to realize the inevitable, and the ICC allowed discontinuance in 1970. On March 22nd, the Ralph Budd-inspired California Zephyr tied up for the last time. The California Zephyr experience lasted 20 years. Racing down the CB&Q's hot main line toward Chicago shows a well-maintained and operated line. When the California Zephyr began operation on March 20th, 1949, Ralph Budd was retiring. Budd's Q was the strongest of the California Zephyr operators, and it had the most influence on the train's conception, design, and operation from the start. The Q had the better financial history and solid backing. This greatly helped to drive the project when it started after the war. Everyone would miss the California Zephyr, even the ones that never quite purchased tickets. Its passing was symbolic of some problems that were beginning to turn the rail industry upside down, and it would take several decades and even government changes and laws to sort out. The GN, NP, SPNS, and the CB&Q all